And we welcome all of you for this opportunity to deal with Dr. King's legacy and the reality of chaos and community and what it means for us. My name is Dumar Harshaw, and I will begin by offering a prayer. So let us pray together. Dear eternal God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you and we praise you for this opportunity for us to gather to deal with issues that trouble our nation tonight, and not only that, but the entire globe. We pray that you would give wisdom and direction. We thank you for your presence and your anointing on all that takes place as we wrestle with the reality of the chaos we now confront and the possibility of community that you can provide. Bless each speaker tonight and those who are listening on as we raise questions and deal with difficult but important issues. I pray this in the awesome name of Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior. Amen. It gives me much pleasure to present our facilitator tonight, dynamic national world leader, Pastor James Wright, and we look forward to his input. He's a true keeper of the dream, and he will now introduce all of these dynamic persons that we have here on this virtual encounter tonight. Pastor James Wright.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Harshaw, and thank you for that introduction. One of the things that I'm excited about is being a part of the Martin Luther King Committee, and that the Martin Luther King Committee as a team knew that this was an important conversation. I'm also excited that I chair the Martin Luther King Commission for the state, as well as an executive for the YMCA. You know, I'm thankful for our time tonight, and one of the realities that was interesting to me is I looked at our flyer, and our flyer, at first I thought it was a misprint, and it was, because Dr. Harshaw gave the title of the book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here? But if you notice in our advertisement, it said Chaos Over Community.
Right.
And I wonder if that captures very much where we are right now. Because as Dr. King had these last words, this was his last book written in 1967. As Dr. King said those words, it's amazing how some of us tend to think that Dr. King is not relevant today, but so much of his reality and words are very prophetic. And in those last words, he said this, he warned that the persistence of racism in the depth and dawning awareness that what's gonna happen is that the Negro demands will still necessitate structural changes in society. And he said that because the Civil Rights Act had been passed, the Voting Rights Act had been passed, but Dr. King in his last book was essentially saying that the work is undone. And he says it necessitates a new phase of resistance in both the North and the South. And so tonight, we believe that we have an opportunity to make sure that what can feel like chaos over community really can be brought back to bear, that it really is community instead of chaos. And I'm thankful that tonight we have several leaders who are going to help us navigate this conversation. Throughout this conversation, please know that you can send in your questions and we will try to get to some of them, but we really want you to understand this is the first of many conversations, as this is a conversation that has been going on for decades, but we must continue with speaking with answers, because we believe that it's time and that many are listening. So tonight, let me introduce several people who are going to help us in this conversation. First, an incredible leader. She's the diversity inclusion leader at Advanced Auto Parts. Her name is Kiwanda Stansberry. She's responsible for creating intentional, strategic initiatives that really advance inclusion and diversity in a culture so that everyone feels welcome in that corporate space. Then we also will have joining with us Jeremy Collins. Jeremy is a civil rights advocate, and that name may sound familiar because Jeremy right now is playing a critical role as the engagement director for North Carolina for Governor Roy Cool. And prior to his post, Jeremy served as a direct counselor of the Racial and Equity Project. Jeremy has been doing an incredible work as a lawyer and lives a life as an activist. We also are thankful that tonight we have Pastor Mark Middleton. Pastor Middleton is familiar while he has a voice that has been powerful in Durham as he is the Ward 2 representative on the city council. The voice of Pastor Middleton has been global for a while now. You also might have heard him on his program called At the Table. Dr. Middleton has been a champion, again, for a variety of spaces, but he's an activist. He's an activist who has more than just a voice, but he creates a reality that brings change, but not just the Bull City, but for all of us. Thankful that we have Eric Gukian. Eric is the president and CEO of the United Way of the Greater Triangle. United Way is a long-standing nonprofit that has found itself being recreated in the midst of all the challenges that we've been facing for a while. And his heart, and I know this from Eric, is to make sure that we have solutions from the cradle to the rest of your career, where healthy families and equity and leadership is more than just words, but really impacting, again, both the public, private, and nonprofit sector. And then I'm thankful for Kellen Moore. Kellen is the president and CEO of the John Rex Endowment. She is the chief equity officer as well as president. And here's why, because her heart and passion is understanding. But once again, the desired impact in both nonprofits and other leaders must continue to include and engage equity in a powerful way. Again, her heart is that families are safe and that individuals through healthy living reach their full potential, and thankful for her presence here. And then I'm thankful as well for Greer Webb. Greer, again, is someone who I believe represents the continued legacy of Dr. King in this generation. You know, when I see Greer, Greer reminds me that the real civil rights movement was led by young people. Greer is a Moorhead scholar. He is at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's the co-chair of the Black Student Political Action Committee, and he's co-founder of the North Carolina Town Hall and Young Americans Protests. So that's our panel tonight. Very thankful for everyone being here with us. So here is my first thought and question. And this first thought and question I want to give to Greer. Now, Greer is going to have to leave early. Here's what I love about Greer. Greer understands the framework of family. His little brother, and he's going to be an incredible big brother, his little brother's experiencing a virtual graduation. And so Greer is going to be leaving us early. But Greer, I want to start with you, and other panelists, feel free to weigh in. But here's the question. So when you think of the death of Breonna Taylor, when you think of the death, again, of Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, I mention her because today she would have been 27 years old. And yes, part of the catalyst to this gathering has been the response to the death of George Floyd. However, this has been a legacy over the decades. We have seen and heard about the killing, the murdering of unarmed Black people, men and women across the country. But here's the question. What is different about the response that we see happening in the country right now? And Greer, you've been an incredible part of this response. So what is the difference in the response that we're seeing right now?
First of all, everyone, thanks for having me on, Pastor White, Pastor Harshaw, and Pam Smith for putting this together. I really appreciate it, and the ability to lend my voice. I think you hit on a very important and poignant point. Today being the birthday of Breonna Taylor, but also looking at Ahmaud Arbery, looking at George Floyd, looking even at the New York Central Park incident with Christian Cooper, and why this is culminating into this movement, right? Not a moment, but a movement toward justice, a movement focused on change. And what I've seen I was thankful to be able to work with the coalition here based out of Raleigh and the Triangle, and was able to be on the streets peacefully in Raleigh with 4,000 others of my brothers and sisters. And I saw diversity of all kinds. That's a word that a lot of folks like to throw out these days. But what does that mean? It means that there were folks out there using their voices. There were folks out there who wanted to be part of the movement, donating water bottles, donating milk in case we needed it, donating gloves and masks and hand sanitizer. There were folks that were actually there in the street. Then when it comes to gender, sexuality, and race, there was also diversity. And I think that it is so important that we are coupling the policy action with being out in the streets. And I think that's just one reason why this is, a little different. Now, it does mirror other movements in the past. And so I'll end by saying this, is that diversity is our strength as a nation. And to see so many of my fellow Black brothers and sisters, but to also see an overwhelming number of my white, brothers and sisters coming out and saying, enough is enough. There are things that we can be doing at the local, state, and national level. And if I can lend my voice in any way, I'm going to do so. Now, there are two pandemics affecting us as people of color and as Black folks in particular, and that's COVID-19, as well as this blatant racism and this brutal and deadly racism. And so thinking of both of those and having allies, strong allies, not just folks that want to take advantage of this moment for their social media, but folks actually willing to do whatever is needed, whatever their specialty is to help in this moment, is why I think it's so different.
Oh, thank you, Greer. Hey, Pastor Middleton, could you tackle that as well?
Sure, absolutely. Let me salute everybody. I'm just so honored to be in this space with all of you freedom fighters. My alum brother of being a keynote speaker for the Triangle MLK Prayer Breakfast, James White, and Greer, you're doing amazing work. Very directly, we are not in a post-racial age, but there are a lot of young people who think we should be. And I think what we're seeing are the birthing pangs, the absolute non-putting up with this stuff of folk who are trying to usher in the post-racial age, although we are not there yet. I think we've got a generation now among us that are having a hard time reconciling seeing a Black man surrounded by all of the accoutrement of power of the White House, walking down the steps of the 747 and having Marines salute him, reconciling that with another grown Black man on the ground crying for his mom with an officer's knee in his neck. And we have a generation, I believe, among us that for them, Black people operating at the highest levels of power is not a novelty. It's a given. It's not so novel to them anymore. And I believe that they think that man lying on the ground with his knee on his neck, same color as that man who lived in the White House on the second floor, there's something wrong with that image, and they are resisting having to reconcile that. And I believe that we are seeing the birth of that. I think what's different also is this sustained protest over these days have brought about some folk who, these are new white folk I'm seeing passed away. I mean, these kids are up in cops' face like, we're all the same. I'm like, these are some new white folk, and I love it. I love the diversity. I love the energy. I love the passion. This is an inflection point in American history. Nothing can be the same going forward. We will be a different country when we get through this.
So it's interesting that you say these are new white people. And here's one of the things, for those of you who are listening, we're going to be real transparent on this panel. No, because I think you bring up a valid point. So I'm going to go to Kellen. Kellen, as he said, these are new white people. And this is not to be offensive to our audience.
No.
But Kellen, does he have a point? I noticed you were shaking your head when he said that.
I've said amen, like I felt like I was in church. I agree. When I think about what's different, and one is I'm a white woman who's here that wouldn't have been here 5 years ago. So one of the things, is the personal journey that I see a lot of white people taking to relearn history, so we don't make those mistakes. But what I think this pandemic, these two crises or multiple crises have done together, is that I think it has put a face on inequities. So white people who have not experienced joblessness, loss of health insurance, maybe loss of their homes because of the pandemic and the economic and health crises we're in, they're starting to realize our humanity. and that we are all the same and all very vulnerable. And so if maybe they appreciate it, I know for me, I've always appreciated the Black Lives Matter movement, but I have a deeper appreciation and understanding through the pandemic, looking at, because I'm a public health person, so I see the data. I know who's dying more and being impacted more. I also know who the essential workers are and who are keeping the country running. Many of them are lower wage workers. So I feel like there's certainly a movement even within our white community to say we can't be silent. Our silence is complicit, and we can't do that anymore.
Thank you, Kellen. So here's the next question. You know, Dr. King's book, From Chaos to Community, he was very clear. And this is what I loved about Dr. King. He was incredibly strategic, as well as philosophical, as well as inspirational, but very strategic. And Dr. King, he talked about, and he outlined his thoughts. He talked about America's plans and future. And he was very specific that there's a need for better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, quality education. And he continued at the time that America really did have the resources and technology to eradicate poverty. What are your thoughts about why do we still struggle as a nation with the perils of poverty in the midst of growing technology? Why is this still a struggle? And Kellen, if you want to take a stab at that, if you want to talk about that for a moment, please do, while we still have you here.
Oh, I'll be here for a while longer, so I'm
right,
happy
but just while you're on camera, you're up front on camera.
I'm on camera.
Yes.
So the perils of poverty, I think, I think we've always thought that pull yourself up by the bootstrap was the way to go, but we know that we know poverty is grounded in structural racism. We know that. So, and the data proves that. So when you think about the wealth gap between Black and white, and you look at the data, in fact, some economists are saying that they believe the net worth of Black people by 2053 will be zero. There's a problem there. There's not a fair, we need to change that dynamic. And I know at the endowment, we're trying to look at what are those systems that need to be disrupted that impact children and families living to their full potential.
Yes.
And how can we be involved in that work?
Oh, thank you. Jeremy Collins, welcome. Glad you're here. Jeremy, could you tackle that question, please?
Well, first of all, thank y'all for having me, and always proud to be with you, Pastor White, Pastor Middleton, Greer, all my friends. Thank y'all for being here. Everybody on the call. You know, I'm gonna give you a short answer because this could take a while. But there's two red herrings here that ain't really problems. The first one is that America was built on poverty of a lot for wealth for a few. That is as American as a apple pie. So when we talk about rooted in structural racism, that's really kind of a eloquent way of saying that we committed ourselves over 200 years ago that this is going to be who we are. And so when we talk about reaching into those things, we're actually talking about not being American. And I don't think we have that discussion enough. The second part of this is, well, the reason it's not a problem is because we have this, in my space, we have a conversation about figuring out how to do things, figuring out what it is that we need to change to create this other situation. And in reality, we have to mine the pennies because the dollars are going to take care of themselves. And so we undo structural racism, we undo inequality, we undo poverty in the little day-to-day decisions that we make. It's the decision to give money to Black-owned businesses as opposed to continuing to prop up majority companies and majority firms. It's the decision to make sure that everyone has access to healthcare as opposed to treating healthcare like it's a luxury. If we want to undo the structural, if we want to do the unequal outcomes, then we have to change the unequal investments that we make. If we make prison investments in young Black children, then we're going to get prison outcomes when they're older. But if we make housing and economic development and structural structural foundational investments on the front end, then that's what we're going to get on the back end too. So we can talk more about it, but I think that gets to the heart of why we are where we are.
Oh, thank you, Jeremy. You know, one of the things that I love with this group of leaders is that everyone understands that it's both structural, systemic, but then there are also personal realities as well. And so, Kawanda, I want you to answer this question. What role does personal accountability play in how we begin to address bias, prejudice, discrimination, and racism? What role does personal accountability play as to how we address that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'm going to kind of follow my fellow panelists here and just thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this great conversation. You know, I thought about this a little bit because I think that what we are experiencing is a collective, it's collective, but also very personal, right? And so you have groups that are coming together and being and as a community, but each one of them represents a different why they're there, right? And I think it's the collection of that makes it most powerful. But I think that personal accountability when it comes to addressing bias and discrimination, you know, has a huge effect on, one, what actions are even taken, the pace of the actions that we take, how far we go. And so if I have not decided what my level of personal accountability is, it's going to be difficult for me to join any movement and be a part of any change. And if I do decide, but I'm committed to the pace of it, I'm not going to create as much change in a certain amount of time, and I'm not going to go as far as I could possibly go. So I think that, you know, as we look at all the groups and all the institutions that are responsible, they are a collection of individual people, and action really starts with the individual person and what they bring to the collective. So I think that for me, it's a critical kind of reflection to say, okay, what is my role in this? What can I do? And what can I add to the entire focus? And I think when you have that particular commitment, then you are able to attack things like bias and inequality or discrimination because you have decided that this is the role that you're going to play.
Good. Hey, Greer, you deal with a lot of people who seem to have engaged this, and seems to be a passion. But Greer, if you could give some insight to that question as well from your perspective.
Yes, I think personal responsibility and specifically personal commitment when it comes to a movement is so important. You know, we're starting to hear this new phrase, performative activism, where folks, you know, will go and post or specifically our white brothers and sisters will, you know, do Blackout Tuesday every week as part of this movement and then kind of fade away and not contribute their best qualities going forward. And what we're looking for here is really lasting impact. So really that looks like a reflection and looking interpersonally at what am I best at doing and how can I contribute that to a movement. You know, just today there was a protest in Raleigh and I had someone come up to me and say, you know, obviously I'm a white male. I don't think that I should be leading any of these chants. And I think that I should deflect that over to this person standing right next to me who's a Black brother. And I said, you know, that is exactly what we're talking about. Coming and being willing to come in the streets, coming and being willing to donate water, but also reflecting and saying, you know, I have a personal stake in this, you know, maybe when it comes to my body, but it's not about me specifically. And I think, you know, whoever we're talking about, it's so important that we make that reflection, that we take a minute to pause and say, you know, what end goal am I looking for and how can I best contribute and support others in this long-standing, long-term movement?
Thank you. Eric, as you have demonstrated that, especially in much of the work that you do, of really challenging, helping people to see some of these issues from a different perspective. But what role does personal accountability play? And Eric, here's my question for you. How does that fit within the systems that we navigate in?
Yeah, I think it fits, again, humbled to be on this great panel with all of you great folks. I think it fits in a lot. We have to come to grips with our own, as a white male, I have to come to grips with and examine and work on my own power and privilege and recognize that I have it. I think that's the first step, is to recognize that we all live in the structural racism And many of us have benefited from it. And I will say, as the CEO of United Way of the Greater Triangle, we've been lauded for doing our part on the racial equity movement, and that we have a program called 10 to Watch, which supports 10 leaders of color that are doing 10 women and leaders of color that are doing amazing work in the Triangle. But if I look myself in the mirror, that's about 10% of our overall investment. And that's not to say that we don't invest in other good programs that support important work in our mission to eradicate poverty. But we really can't rest, and we really can't be slow and gradual about our effort to make sure that every penny and every dollar, and we've got a few of them, that goes to a racial justice framework. And we in the nonprofit community, we in the corporate community, all have to work at this. And the pace has been far too slow for far too long, and we all have to recognize that and move quickly to invest. We've talked a lot about power and about structural power. Well, I sit in a powerful position, and I need to recognize that and leverage that power to ensure that that we move things we move quickly in a racial justice model.
There's this theme that all of you have mentioned that I want several of you to speak to, because you've mentioned systemic racism, and some even have a hard time, and some would even say that, well, what are you talking about? And the challenge with that is it's pervasive in every institution in our country, but how do you dismantle something that is invisible to so many? How do you dismantle systemic racism when it can be invisible to so many? Pastor Middleton?
Thank you for giving me the easy questions. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar recently wrote a wonderful piece where he said, when you don't know there's so much dust in the room until you let the sunlight in, and you see all the dust floating in the air. For those of us without housekeepers, we understand what he means by that. So here's the deal. We have to first acknowledge that it exists. And here's the thing about what's so insidious about systemic racism. You don't have to be a racist to perpetuate it. We were just talking about personal accountability. You don't have to be the N-word using, robe wearing, racial slur hurling type person. You can really be a good person, but participate and perpetuate institutional racism, which becomes systemic racism when it starts crossing institutions, other institutions. It becomes systemic. A same resume, but you have an ethnic sounding name as opposed to a white sounding name or a neutral sounding name, and you get the job. You have just benefited from systemic racism, and you could have Black friends and participate in systemic and institutional racism. So here's the deal. I used to be, along my intellectual journey and development, I once flirted with nationalism because my thinking was that every institution in America has to be deconstructed, from baseball to the Constitution to you name it. It all requires renegotiating in order for us to be fully participant in it. So we have a choice. We can either dismantle everything and start over, or we can work to reform. We can work to change it, make it a more perfect union. We have this aspirational language, even as part of our American creedal statements. We push. So the very short answer, direct, and then I'll yield because I want to hear what other folks say. One, I think every white person should take racial equity training. Period. Because until you see the actual corpus of laws, not just cultural, not just some folk getting together informally, when you see from the very advent of this nation, the way laws, codified systems have conspired to deny first Black folk and other folk of color wealth, access, power, you'll understand how systemic racism has a legacy even today. And I think that should be about personal accountability. If I can just say real quick something about personal accountability, it's one of those statements that's kind of like articulate. It depends upon which prism you put it through, it has different impact. Black folk hear personal accountability, and oftentimes it's been hurled against us to say, be better fathers, get a job. White folk for personal accountability, it means realizing that although you may pay all your bills on time and you're a good person, that you have wealth and benefits that are systemically conferred upon you because of stuff you may not even know about that predates you. So that we got to learn how this system has been constructed so we can be armed to deconstruct it.
Greer, I know you have to get ready to go, but I would love for you to weigh in on this question as you have to get ready to leave us.
Yes, I'd love to. I just finished recently reading Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I definitely recommend that to a lot of folks, specifically our white brothers and sisters. But when it comes to dismantling systems, what I think about is something that we've all alluded to here, and that's shifting the narrative from having a good intent to having good actions. You can have a great intent, but if your actions don't follow through and begin to uplift people of color, and specifically Black folks, then the intent is not all that important. Now, it takes personal responsibility and accountability, as Brother Middleton mentioned, but it also takes those action-based plans. And that is something that we can begin to perpetuate and make normal in our communities at the local, state, and national level. And so I think that's so interesting. And in his book, I think Kendi alludes to calling it foundational racism as opposed to systemic racism, because this country it's so ingrained in our history. And when we're talking about our history, to Kellen's point, we need to focus on that, especially when it comes to white folks. I'm in a summer school session right now focused on African American history since 1865 at UNC, and it's been eye-opening for me. And we have students even that don't go to UNC, of all colors, that are in that class and saying, wow, now I can understand why we are where we are because of this, virus that has infected us from our very onset. So coupling that history with understanding the personal responsibility and the foundation that racism thrived on and continues to thrive upon here in our country can help inform us better when it comes to speaking up as all people on those local levels, making sure that we're holding our leaders accountable, not only in their words and their intents, but in their actions. And with that, I do have to say goodnight, but I appreciate all of y'all, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and hope to see you all soon and continue social distancing, and we can get through and continue moving and changing.
Greer, thank you so much. And you know what? I love your shirt, and Greer, we're excited about who you are as a leader. And so thank you very much for being with us. Kellen, you begin touching on this point in your comment in the beginning of our time. I'd love for you to speak to how do you deal with it? How do you help people understand something that is so invisible?
So when I think about that, one thing we say in our office all the time that I've been learning in my journey is that race is always at the table. It just depends on how you want to show up. So we were starting it by saying, oh, we do health equity. And then we evolved into equity. And then we got specific to, let's talk about racial equity, because it is always there. And how does it show up? So just saying that as a staff and board, doing our equity journey individually and collectively, and we have an equity leadership team that's made up of staff and board, and so we are intentional with our equity consultants. We caucus white employees, Black employees, and then we come together. So there's an intentionality that I think it helps lift the veil and make it visible, and that's really important to us, is to be, we say we're on a learning journey, we're going to give each other grace, but we're going to do this because it's so important. If we want to have impact, back to what Greer said, we have to understand root cause. And we really need to talk about Black and brown children, not just vulnerable children. And when we do that, and we help those children and families, then we help all of Wake County. And that's where we are in our journey. And it's, I just encourage every company, whether you have especially white leaders, it's a time. And if not us, who? So we're going to do that at the endowment and hope we will get better every single day and our work will have more impact.
So the endowment, we love sort of the partnership that we had as a YMCA. Someone asked, where do I go for racial equity training? And so if you can, You can look online. It's the Racial Equity Institute.
Yes.
And then there's several places, and you have the Racial Equity Institute, which is a 2-day experience. And then they offer even a 3-hour experience called Groundwater.
Groundwater, yeah.
It really does begin to start you off in this conversation.
Yeah, we were great to do that with you all. That was wonderful.
So here's another question that sort of moves to this. And Jeremy, I'd love for you to tackle this. But do we continue to seek to reform existing laws and programs, or do we need to have a more radical approach, maybe to upend some systems that continue to fail? Jeremy, could you tackle that question?
Well, thank you for the question. It's an easy one. The only thing keeping us from radical change is this white supremacy structure, and that's a difficult thing to say for and just own. But I want to be really clear. I'm gonna use some examples. I'll give you one example: the criminal justice system, mass incarceration. We all know when we talk about these racism and these systems that are invisible. I think they're invisible, but like air. We all know it's in the room, but there's something about it that's not compelling until a certain point. We can all know that certain people or certain communities get treated differently, but for some reason we're not compelled to do something about it until there's some tipping point. But for me, when I see folks come to the legislature on a annual basis, begging for second chances, begging for opportunities to ban the box, these incremental piecemeal shifts, as opposed to radically changing a thing that we know is tied to slavery, chattel slavery, indentured servitude, racism, Jim Crow. We know that these linkages, but there's a power structure in place that will not allow revolutionary change. And so while I know how we get to that place, I also have to acknowledge that there's yet a supremacy structure in that space that keeps us from going to the place that we need to be. So what we have to do, we're forced to do both. We're forced to seek incremental change until we can get to the place where we know we all belong. It's really funny. It's really funny. What happens is when we get to that place, there will be folks who say, we should have done this a long time ago. And I remind folks that, but for some small minority of majority folks, or folks who are not yet compelled to make that decision, we could be in that place. We could have expanded Medicaid in North Carolina years ago, but there's a group of people who don't want to see that happen. We could end mandatory minimums decades ago. There's a group of people who don't want to see that happen. We could expand the welfare state. We could end poverty, as Dr. King said in his book. But we don't want to do that. We choose to invest in the systems and structures that maintain poverty and inequality, as opposed to eradicating those things for a society where everybody thrives.
So Jeremy, let me ask you a question. When you use the word a white supremacist structure, some of our listeners, as soon as they hear that, their implicit bias kicks in. Right. And they go, oh, wait a minute. He's talking about the Ku Klux Klan. He's talking about an extremist. So help us understand what you mean by that word white supremacist, but especially to those who may have a reaction neurologically that stops them from hearing what you really mean.
Yeah, thank you for that. When I use that frame, or when I use that phrase, what I'm specifically talking about is the system of governing and codes that America has put in place literally before we even signed ourselves into these United States of America, North Carolina, the southern states. Beyond that, this code that we know that race is a social construct, so there's nothing that's inherently tied to any one of the color of our skins. But what we've done is anything that would allow any power structure or any system that would allow you to allow another person to be marginalized. I think someone said earlier, you don't have to call someone the N-word. You don't have to wear a white sheet. You can just not be anti-racist and be upholding that supremacist state. And so you also don't have to say, I believe that white people are supreme to everyone else. But if you can be ignorant or blind or see a thing as invisible so that it doesn't even matter to you while other people peril under that system, that is too supremacy and upholding a supremacy narrative.
Anybody else want to respond? Pastor Middleton?
Sure. Sure. Thank you so much for the question. Listen, America got started because a group of white folk were mad at another group of white folk for treating them like they were black folk. So we've got a radical trajectory. America got started because some thugs and looters emptied some tea into a harbor. And listen, I use the word looter intentionally because you can't tell me some of that tea did not make it home. All of that tea did not go in that harbor. These were tea drinkers. You gonna tell me all that good tea went in the harbor? So some of it, come on now, brothers and sisters, you know some of that tea went home. And listen, and even with that, the first person to die in the movie was still a black guy, Crispus Attucks at the start. So America really, in and of itself, is a radical proposition if we take seriously. Listen, the longest war going on in America is not Afghanistan, it's the American Revolution. We keep fighting that battle, but this time we're fighting it in the mirror. Are we going to be who we say we truly are? So I would suggest that if we get some people, listen, America is the only country in history that ever write down the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal, and put that in their codified documents. Nobody else wrote that down. So if we get some people, what does that look like when it comes to wealth? What does that look like when it comes to power sharing? We already claimed the radical mantle. We need leaders like Greer Webb and this new generation of folk coming up, and folk that are in place now, for old folk like Jeremy and me, that are in place now to take seriously who we say we are. America's already got a racial equity document at its core. The problem is apparently people read it differently than others. But I think if we applied it, we elected a whole black president, and we're still struggling even to this day. So we need some leaders who are not afraid to talk about reparations. I'm going to say it. We need some leaders because listen, you can, and I appreciate making the penny decisions every day, but I'm not the best math student. I don't know how many years it would take to make penny decisions to catch up with 400 years of a head start from somebody else. We need bold leaders who aren't afraid to apply the Declaration and the Constitution radically and to its logical conclusion, and talk about things like reparations and universal basic incomes and things like that. And if not my generation, I think the generation that we see in the streets going on day, 9, 10, 11 in America, I think they're ready to have that conversation. We are at an inflection point, and I believe you are seeing the birthing pangs of that radical redefinition or rediscovery of our definition going on in American streets all around in American great cities tonight as we speak.
So Pastor Middleton has mentioned something, Kawana, that I want to ask you a question. Someone had a question. What do companies need to do to support their employees of color who are traumatized by all of this that we're talking about, but especially by this current crisis? Because we've given timelines and dates that make this seem like this is the never-ending story.
Yeah.
So what can companies do to deal with and to help employees? How can they support them?
Yeah, so I wanted to also just add one quick note that I think ties this to the previous question, which is, how do we dismantle systemic racism? And I think it's about those who are in positions of power and influence that need to be more active, right? I think you always have those who are at disadvantages through those systems, but I think it's those who benefit the most and have the power to do that need to show up. And I think we're seeing that a lot more now, but I think about that in terms of corporate institutions and think about who's at the decision-making table, right? And so those decision makers have a responsibility to dismantle those systems within their own institution and organization. And they can, I think the best way to just explain how I think it's important for leaders to support their Black and African American, or even team members or employees of color, is to just take a moment to connect with them and get to know them and understand. I think that leaders assume a lot that they have to have the answers, right? As soon as a question comes up, or they need to be able to have a solution, and they come with this solution-focused approach as opposed to a learning approach, and say,
Right.
let me understand really what's impacting you. Let me take that in and digest that, and then come with the solution and use my position of power to help you. But I think until you really know what the problem is, it's going to be hard for you to support it or to make any change and eliminate the problem. So I think that there's a lot of power in leaders listening to their team members and hearing. And then I think part two of that is take action on that. How are you going to act on that? Because it's one thing for me to explain to you or share with you my experience or share with you things that are challenging for me that may not be challenging for, the white or Caucasian team members in this organization. But after you are aware of that, then now you have a responsibility to actually do something about it. And I think that organizations can really put their action where their passion is, right? And put their passion into practice. And when we hear leaders say, there's a no tolerance, policy for this, we need to see the actions that also illustrate that. And I think that's one way that leaders can really demonstrate and actually take action to meet the needs of their employees of color.
Thank you. Dr. King, in his letters to a Birmingham jail, had a concept that is a concept that he warned people about, and it was the white moderate. And he described this in part as one who prefers negative peace, which is the absence of tension, rather than positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Now, let's just be clear. This idea of being a moderate is not just with white people. This is also with white people and many people who prefer, let's just have peace. It's the Rodney King mantra of, can't we just all get along? And Dr. King warned about that. So in your work, have you witnessed this behavior? And then how does it impede progress towards racial equity and social justice? And I want to go to Eric. Eric, have you witnessed this idea, let's just have peace, and how does it impede the work?
Yeah, I'm guilty of it. If I got to be honest, if I'm complicit in it, and I think we've all tried to go along to get along at one time or another, and I'm certainly guilty of that. And I think where we are now, particularly those of us, be it government or the foundation community or the corporate community, philanthropy, we need to move from a charity model to a justice model, and we need to do it real fast and not on the edges. Just to build on Kawanda's points, those that are closest to the problem are generally the people who know how to solve the problem. But that structure is in place where you've got a lot of folks in power that want to hold on to that power, that want to make those decisions for other people. And that's the kind of system that we need to dismantle. We need to get, so I spent a lot of time in education, and it was, and we've all spent a lot of time on various boards. And it is too often that we have one representative of the particular community that we are serving, and that person is the only person that is not getting paid at that table, and that is the only person that doesn't have a vote in terms of where funds are distributed. And that needs to flip, and it needs to flip fast, and it's flipping out on the streets right now. So that's where we need to move as a community and as leaders, and we need to take responsibility for that. And that starts with me as a white man.
So as you say that, Eric, here's just a follow-up question. You talk about moving again from a charity model to a justice model. Yep. So Eric, are some of the programs that we have now possibly keeping people in poverty? Well,
we've referenced the Racial Equity Institute, and one of the things, I'm stealing this straight from them, and many of us know this, but there's a water problem. And what we're trying to do is cure the fish with many of the charity. And the problem is that the water is sick, it's polluted, and that's what we need to fix. And we're all swimming in it. So it's taken that approach of, there's nothing wrong, and we're proud to support food banks and things that provide people with basic needs. But what we need to really move towards is that systemic change. And that's a lot harder, but but it gets a lot easier if we bring folk to the table that are not the same old folk.
Thank you.
Sure.
You know, what would you say, Jeremy? Because some people will hear this and are listening now, and they could be frustrated because we're talking about systemic issues. We're talking about long-term, challenges. What would you all say to people who say, but no, we want solutions now? Jeremy, what would you say to people who say, no, do something now?
I would say to them that we have to be doing it now. That the marches in the streets have to not just demand kind of conversations. Some of my white friends sent me a Instagram message the other day about there's conversations that are happening in the white community. Very, very good, not a bad thing. The problem is we in the marginalized community don't have time for a lot of conversations because there's not just a knee on the neck of a cop with a knee on someone's neck in the street. There's an economic knee on all of our necks right now. There's a housing knee on the neck right now. So we have to figure out what we can dismantle and undo some of this policy stuff right now. I've been really proud of a lot of leadership over the past several days. One of the good things that the governor has done, the governor of North Carolina has done to address disparities, in addition to a long-term prospective task force, was to implement 2 deliverables right now to provide health care to uninsured North Carolinians who suffer from diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, and pulmonary illness. And also because we know that Black businesses are being shut out of the SBA loan paycheck protection program, and even some of the other COVID-19 incentives to stand up a small business enterprise to get grants to small minority businesses. And so we can march in the streets and talk about all the things that need to happen long-term, and racial equity conversations, and what is structural racism, and what is white supremacy versus white nationalism. I saw somebody mentioning that in the stream. We can have those conversations, but there are things to be done right now that we can make decisions on that change the livelihood and outcome of people in all of our communities, and we got to be working towards both of them.
Kelly, yes,
I just wanted to add to that. I think people got to vote. These solutions are going to be local, and we need to make sure that we've got the right elected officials who are committed to building a more equitable community. So I encourage everyone, since we're going to have that opportunity sooner than later, that voting becomes important to support everything. Jeremy, I agree with everything you said. If we're going to move it quickly, I think also as we move quickly, for us in philanthropy, we think, well, we first don't want to make sure we're not doing harm. First, do no harm. So I think how we go fast now, we need to make sure that we're actively listening and getting solutions from people who really understand the issues.
Thank you. So I want everyone to answer this last question, but I need you to hear something. These were Dr. King's last words, that moment that really was his last prophetic moment. And he said this, it's one that we remember, those last words in Memphis, where he said this. He says, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go to the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. I got a question for each of you. When you are on the mountaintop, and each of you are leaders, you've been asked to be on this call because each of you are mountaintop leaders. But when you look over the mountaintop, what do you see? Kelly?
I see communities that have direct access to the resources they need to thrive.
Thank you, Kelly. Kawanda, what do you see?
I see more Black and brown leader faces that are helping to make the decisions that we need to inspire real change, create real change. And I see them right alongside the white faces. I see us all collectively still a part of the change.
Thank you. All right, Eric, what do you see?
I see the eradication of poverty.
Jeremy, what do you see?
You know, what I don't see is America. What I see is I see a lot of things. What I don't see is a table. What I see is people who are moving in the same direction, unencumbered by anything or anyone else. That's what I see.
Pastor Middleton, what do you see?
I see more battles, but I see a much more diverse army and a much better equipped army. I want to do something strange. I want to appeal to the collective wisdom of slave owners for a second, who got together and wrote these words. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. And I remember some of us are old enough to remember Schoolhouse Rock. I used to sing the preamble, and I realized it's appropriate to sing it because it's really formulaic. We read the preamble of the Constitution almost as a haphazard array: establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. But if we read it as a formula, we realize domestic tranquility is peace. But what comes before peace is justice. So really, it was white slave owners who first cried out, no justice, no peace. Even they got it. So we have to realize that justice, what we're seeing in the streets now is non-domestic tranquility is because of the first clause. We don't see justice. And until we see justice, this is what it looks like. This is what America looks like. So I see a much more diverse army, but I'm optimistic. I believe what Dr. King saw was probably another mountain in the distance, but in the valley, a much more unified and diverse, well-fed, well-equipped, multiracial army. And I think we are seeing their ranks form in American cities, even as we speak now. No justice, no peace.
With Dr. King, he said, you know, I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He talked about that which was transcended, engaging and making sure that the dreams would happen. But here's what I love about Dr. King. I believe you all who have been with us, each of you have that same spirit. All of you are leading in a space to where you may not get there, but you're leading in such a way that others will. I can't thank you enough for that. And I'm thankful that for us, we're just beginning. Both for us and the Martin Luther King Committee, we really want to facilitate more of these conversations. There's so much more to be said. We have just begun. Martin Luther King Commission, other groups, many of you as well. We want to continue because I'm thankful that tonight is just a conversation to be the catalyst to what Martin Luther King said would be true. And I believe as Dr. King looks over the balcony, he's telling us all, this is still part of the journey. We must keep going on. And so because of that, we're going to close, but I thank you each. Each of you have been incredible. What I love is that each of you are in a variety of disciplines and realities to live out these truths and make a difference for us. And I hope those of us who have tuned in can see and understand why we've had leaders from every sphere of influence. But I'm going to ask Reverend Lucas, if you could close us in a word of prayer. Thank you all for joining us. Please join us in prayer with Reverend Lucas if you could close.
Thank you.
I think he's muted.
Yeah.
I was still praying with him, but he wasn't.
I missed it.
Correct.
Me too.
I was with you, brother.
You felt the presence. You felt it.
Reverend Lucas, not a silent prayer.
Right. Holy Spirit don't need no sound. Holy Spirit don't need no sound. You don't need no sound.
Amen.
Go ahead.
Amen. That's why I have you here. That's why I need you here, my councilman, Mark Gaffney. Thank God. Apologize for that. But God, we come to God as humble as we know how. The God of everything that is, was, and shall be. God, we've heard so many voices today, but we come to you because we know that you are the real power. Other folk think they have power. They have perceived power, but you have power to change, power to deliver, power to set free. You've proven it over the eons of ages. So God, tonight we come to you as humble as we know how, saying many are the plans of men and women, but it's you that bring them to pass. God, we come to you as humble as we know how, saying, what are we as little microscopic organisms that you're even mindful of us? Oh, what an awesome God of the cosmos we serve. So God, just like our ancestors did, just like many others did, God, that over 400 years of involuntary servitude, but yet we had Charles Hamilton Houston. Yet, God, so many people have overcome the racism and the hatred and bigotry. The same way you delivered them, you'll deliver us today. So God, we thank you for what has been said, but you get all the power, all the glory, and all the honor as we come to you in expectation, so that this idiotic thing called racism, this artificial thing called skin color that individuals have put in place just to keep their power, perceived power. We come to the God of all power saying, set your people free. Let our people go. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Have a good evening, you all.